What is up, guys? Welcome to the 19th tutorial in our Python language basics. Now that we're done with while loops, let's move to the next loop type, which will be the for loop or the for in loop. In Python, there is no traditional for loop. There is actually only the for in loop, so we're going to be using the terms for loop and for in loop interchangeably. So just like before, we're going to start by creating a for loop and running a for loop. But because for loops or for in loops need to be paired with ranges or lists, we're going to be incorporating those into this as well. So we'll start with ranges, talk about some tips and tricks, and then we'll go over to coupling lists with for in loops. So let's head on over to the code now. Alright, so we ended the previous section 18 by talking about while loops. As per usual, we'll get ourselves a new cell started. Okay, so let's just zoom in there and begin. Okay, so let's just talk quickly about the structure of a for loop or for in loop. It will look something like this: for some variable, I'm just going to call it var for short, in, and then some range / list, okay, and then we execute the code here. All right, so a few things to note. First of all, we always pair this with a range or a list or some kind of other iteratable object. Could be a tuple, could be a dictionary, we're getting keys, items, etc. But it needs to be some sort of an iterable item. Okay. Next up, we have a variable. So because a for loop visits every member in the specified range or list, this variable will take on the value of the current item we're visiting. Don't worry, that will become a little clearer later on. And then, of course, we have the code to actually execute. Okay, so let's start by pairing this with a range, just to keep things simple. That will be kind of the more the more commonly seen for loop, unless you are specifically iterating through some sort of a list or something. So let's say we have a range from 1 to 5. We just want to print out the first 5 numbers, kind of like before with this while loop, even though these were technically X positions, but whatever. Okay, so we're going to say something like for I in the range from 1 to 6. Remember, the range 1 to 6 will include the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but not 6. We're just going to print out I. So let's go ahead and run this, and we get our result. Now, a couple things to note here. First of all, is the range. So you should be familiar with ranges and how they work. Again, we include the lower number, but not the higher number. This is kind of 1 less than this number. This will contain all of the whole numbers, 1 through 5 inclusive. Okay. If we want to step over numbers, let's say we wanted every other number, we could add a step like this. If we wanted to print things backwards, we can wrap this in a reversed like this, but you guys should already know that from our ranges section, okay? You can even create a range variable like this, just say something like our range is going to be equal to this, okay? And then use our range like so. Okay, that's totally valid as well. So the second thing to note is our variable I. So we can really call this whatever we want. I can call this item, I can call this number, I can call this num. It doesn't really matter. I just use I because it's not really, our for loop is just going to be used to print stuff out. It's not really doing very much. So that's fine. We don't need to give it an explicit name. Realistically, if you are performing a specific task, you should be naming your variables to represent what that task is doing. So if this is representing numbers, just whatever, we're printing out numbers, then you should call this num or number or something like that, but I is fine for now. Okay. So third of all is exactly what I is representing. So again, a for in loop by default will visit every single member of a range or a list. It starts at the beginning, and then it goes to the next member, and then it finishes at the end. Okay. So the way that this would run is it gets to our range, it gets the first value, in this case 1, and then assigns that value to I. We print it out, it loops back up to the top. It visits the next member of the range, which is the number 2. It assigns that value into I and prints it out, loops back up to the top, and keeps doing this until it reaches the end. The final number will be 5. So it assigns that value, prints it out, and then it loops to the top, says, okay, we've reached the end of our range. And so we need to break and do whatever code down here. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to do is talk about for loops paired with lists. and how to pair our for loops with lists. So what we'll do is we'll just start by creating some list. In fact, I'm going to call this inventory. Okay, and this is just going to be a list of random stuff. So we'll have something like boots, arrows, we can have a bow, sword, whatever we want in here. Okay, so just populate this with some items. Maybe you have like a medieval themed game. So maybe we just want to iterate through this list and just print out everything we want to kind of list all the items in the inventory. That's actually fairly straightforward. We can say for something like item in inventory, we are again just going to print out our inventory. Oh, this should be our item rather, not our whole inventory. Okay, so we can do that. As you can see, we got boots, arrows, bow, and sword. Okay, so that's great. That's even more straightforward than our range, because with the range we still had to specify a start and an end position, or end condition rather, but with our inventory, our list here, we didn't even need to do that. We just needed to tell it that we have a list of items and we want to do something for each of these. So once again, the item variable here is going to take on the value of each of these as it reaches it, and then it prints it out. One other thing I should note is that if we don't really care about this value, so let's say for whatever weird reason, we wanted just to print out our inventory 4 times. Okay, so each time we visit a member of the inventory, we want to print out the entire inventory. Not sure why we'd want to do that, but let's just say we did, which means we didn't need this variable. You can actually replace that with an underscore, okay, meaning we don't really care about that value. But generally speaking, it's better practice to do this and to actually assign and use that variable. Alternatively, what we could do is use a range from 0 to 4, okay, and use that to access an inventory at an I, okay, and print that out. So something like this. For I in range from 0 to 4, in fact, we could just say range up to 4, we're going to print out inventory of I. Okay, so this will do exactly the same thing as this, but this is much cleaner syntax, because what if we don't know the length of the list? This doesn't really care. Okay, this figures out what the length of the list is, what the size of the list is, and then it takes care of all of that work for us. Okay? Now, there are 2 more things I want to go over really, really quickly. One is that we can absolutely use our continue and break statements, so our control flow statements in our loop, in our for loops. Okay, so these are absolutely not restricted to while loops. We can use them as necessary in our for loops. So let's say we wanted to break out of our loop prematurely. We only wanted the first 2 items. Okay, so what we could do is, I'm actually just going to comment these out because I don't want them printed multiple times. I could say something like print the inventory I, and then if I equals, let's say we want I equals 1. Okay, so we've got 0, printed that out, 1, printed that out. If I equals 1, then we just want to break. Okay, so that works just fine. I mean, it doesn't really make much sense that we would do something like this, but just know that it can actually work. Same with continue. We can absolutely use those. Just be careful again, because continue, continue will not result in a for in loop running forever, but continue can result in a while loop running forever. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that we can convert every single for in loop to a while loop, but we cannot convert every while loop to a for in loop. Okay? The reason being, again, we don't necessarily know all of the time. Some of the time we do, but not all of the time how many times a while loop will run. Whereas for in loops have a very specific structure. We know exactly how many times a for in loop is going to run. Okay, so if it's something like a game loop, you don't know how many cycles that game loop will run. Maybe it'll be 1,000. Maybe the player will die right away, so it'll only be a few. Maybe the player will play for hours, so it could be hundreds of thousands or millions of iterations. We don't really know. But with a for in loop, we're always pairing them with a specific set range, a finite range, and a finite list or something like that. Okay, so just a really, really quick example of how we might convert this into a while loop. Actually, it might end up looking something very similar to this. We basically just want this functionality here. We could create an iterator variable, so let's just say I is equal to 0, and then we could say something like while we don't need the brackets, I is less than 4, okay? Or we could just get the length of our inventory. That's probably better practice. Inventory, okay? In that case, we could just print out inventory of I, okay? And then we, of course, need to increase it by 1, because otherwise that loop will run infinitely. Again, I'm just going to comment that guy out, comment that guy out, and we should get probably exactly the same result. Okay, boots, arrows, bow, and sword. All right, so easy conversion, for loop to a while loop, but we can't always do it the other way around. So that is pretty much it for now. We covered a fair bit within our for loops. Again, pair them always with ranges or lists. What I would like to see you guys do, although I mean I won't actually know that you guys are doing this, but I recommend that you practice your for loops a little bit, especially practice with ranges. So maybe practice printing out every other element, so just boots and bow or something like that. Maybe using a step in your range. Maybe try reversing it. Okay, and then try pairing inventory, or try pairing a for loop with stuff like dictionaries or maybe tuples or something like that, just until you really get the hang of it. When you're ready to move on, we'll go to a new topic. Okay, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. I will see you guys in the next one.